Was the hardcore wipe for EFT a failure? Hardcore Tarkov has had a very tumultuous reputation since it was released with the most recent wipe. Tons of opinions across the community, ranging from this being the most fun wipe players have had to the absolute worst, how did BSG think this was a good idea? It's been crazy to see so many different people talking about the handling of this wipe as a whole, and it's barely been 2 weeks. Which is crazy because with all the changes coming from BSG, it's felt like 2 months. But we've barely scratched the surface, and yet we kind of know what to expect for the foreseeable future. And while everyone else has had their own opinions, mine is that this wipe had the potential to be one of the most impactful shakeups to the game since it was launched. I stand by the idea that Tarkov has needed a shakeup on this scale for a very long time. Something that would definitely make players hesitant to try it, but would eventually give way to a difficult but enjoyable experience that truly tests the mettle of an EFT player. It could have been amazing, and yet it's only been okay. A complete failure? That depends on who you ask, but let's talk about how BSG could have changed the game to preserve the hardcore experience while also making respectable and reasonable changes that many would have agreed with, and where do we go from here in regard to a more hardcore experience? The first and most glaring mishandling was the transit system. I will defend this hill that transit, if the mechanic itself was more fleshed out, could have been an awesome experience. Limiting our playable area to a handful of maps would have been okay if all the issues that transit had before this wipe were resolved a long time ago. Players spawning on top of each other, longer than average queue times, and incentives for players to even want to use the mechanic in the first place. BSG's original plan was to slowly roll out more maps as time went on, while having players get around EFT using the transit points. And this would have been fine if some concessions were made to allow alternate ways of getting to where you wanted to go. Having the available maps at the start have as many places to transit as possible would have at least removed the headache of having to transit more than once. If people only had to go through one extra loading screen, yeah, there still would have been complaints, but the general population would have at least been more receptive to the idea. If that idea was just simply off the table, then random maps opening up as you go through your raid would have at least made playing feel more dynamic. Or again, an idea I pitched in the previous video, allowing the useless flare colors to have some purpose by opening up more maps if you use them. There were plenty of ways transit could have been smoothly added into the game and stuck around for more than 2 days. But sadly, we will never get that chance to experience the style of game again. And I had a couple of awesome transit-related experiences, especially with one trying to get a LEDX out of a raid safely. The stories that people could have shared, it would have been amazing. But if open world is off the table, then I think sadly forcing transit use is also off as well. The secure container changes were questionable at best. It's weird that for years, many players were telling them to restrict allowing any items inside the container whilst you're in raid. And yet, BSG did the exact opposite of that, restricting what can go inside the container at all times, and it was mainly medical items except stimulants. That's one where the community was right all along. Just make it so that almost any item can go in the container, but once you're in raid, nothing can go in. Find a flash drive? You gotta get out with it. Find a stack of good ammo from a loot crate? No boofing that for yourself. It was a very simple and clear change that would have made most players go, yeah, that makes sense, okay, I can work with that. But the complete opposite happened, and it left players scratching their heads and asking why. The same goes for insurance. It would have just been easier to turn off the mechanic entirely. Instead, we had tons of players reflexively hit insure all on their starting gear and spend 6 figures effectively losing their money on day 1. No insurance, I think, is still fair in a hardcore scenario. It makes you unable to fraud your gear in raid, and you have to make big decisions on what you potentially sacrifice should you find something better in raid. What would have also made this more interesting is if Fence, the useless vendor, started selling dropped player gear on his market for more money. That way, if you just so happen to check his inventory, you might find an armor or stripped weapon you can grab and kit up for yourself. But we'll be talking about Fence more in depth in the coming days. Both of these systems were clear cut, and it was obvious what BSG had to do for this to be right, and they still messed it up. We have already talked about the bosses at length, so to keep it somewhat brief, they should have never been 100% spawns at the start. It goes against the entire idea of hardcore and allows players to farm them for their good gear, which wasn't touched at all in spite of the constant spawn chance. So, start them at 0% for the first day, at least, then you can quickly give them percents each passing day until they hit about 45 to 50%. That way, they're certainly around, but their presence invokes this thought in your head of, is it worth to go looking for them to fight, or do I just carry on with my questing and not risk it? Again, very simple to implement, and people would have been happy with this rollout, but again, we somehow got the opposite of that. Them lowering the spawn rates now, multiple times, doesn't do anything. The damage is already done. People have farmed the bosses. Just leave the spawn rates alone and just learn from this mistake. Another topic we've discussed already, but the hideout was fine as it was before this hardcore wipe. Just remove the found and raid requirement. Wait, well, actually, if we couldn't put anything in our container, I guess it wouldn't have mattered. But still, remove the requirement anyway so anything can be used in the hideout, and if you're so worried about some of the crafts being overused by players, just remove those too, and boom, the hideout is functional, it's optional for those who want to invest in it, and it doesn't feel like an absolute slog to get going like it currently does now. Probably the only part of this hardcore experience most players have been okay with, the traders have been handled surprisingly well. No leveling them up for about a week, and their requirements have been raised somewhat, making you invest even more into them if you really want to see their upgraded wares. I think the only thing players would have benefited from seeing is way more barters for items that people care about. Simple barters for basic weapons, ammos, and medications would have really gone a long way. On top of that, updating the already existing barters to be more cost effective would have been greatly appreciated. There are some old ass barters in this game that are so whack sale wise they are never worth it. But how cool would it have been if you saw like a kitted up gun from mechanic that you wanted, and it was something like a couple weapon parts and some tools. Again, nothing crazy, but something to actively remember and even write down in the in-game notes so you can always take advantage of that barter option. I'm happy enough with the handling of the traders during hardcore, but it definitely could have been that much better. Ignoring Ref, of course, he just shouldn't exist this wipe, he's a travesty. I posed a rather dramatic question at the start of the video. Was this hardcore experiment a failure? Because at the end of the day, that's all this was. An experiment to limit test what players are okay with and what they'll push back against. It would not surprise me this is being used as a testing ground for how some elements will play like in the 1.0 version. I also have some heavy transgressions about whether or not the game is going to be 1.0 later this year. Something tells me it'll be pushed back to 2026, but only time will tell. But the hardcore experience should have just been handled better. I mean, to be brutally honest, BSG for years now should have been testing many of these elements in small doses for a long time, just to get an idea of how to implement them properly so they don't ruin certain parts of the game. That way, when it is almost time for 1.0, they can put everything they've learned about hardcore into one huge, proper wipe experience. Like they did here, but, with more grace and understanding of what players want out of a hardcore experience. So to answer the question, no, it wasn't a failure per se, but it has already been tamed down somewhat to a point that begs the question of what was the point if the entire process was going to get watered down as much as it did. The essence of what makes a hardcore wipe so interesting and enjoyable has been lost by the developers somewhat. It's about amplifying parts of the game that can lead to success, letting those moments shine through and giving players more opportunities to experience that instead of the obtuse and half-assed restrictions and limitations we've felt across the game. I can only imagine they will continue to iterate and hopefully improve on the hardcore wipe as it continues. Maybe then we can have a proper send-off before the game fully releases and we have to experience potentially a brand new game all over again. Hardcore Tarkov was kind of a mess at the start. It was all over the place, changes were being made left and right, and not being relayed to players through the game or even the client. It was a drip feed of information by other players getting it onto platforms where more people will see it. The goal was to provide a more challenging experience that tested the knowledge and adaptability of the player to make the best decisions they possibly can give any situation. But largely, it has been a mishmash and hodgepodge of half-thought-out changes, additions, and redirections that left the player base feeling lost and somewhat bitter about the whole experience. It's a shame hardcore had to go down like this. It was close to being an enjoyable experience even if it was harder. People like a challenge and having to overcome hardships, because it makes the reward so much more satisfying than anything you could have experienced. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to watch this video. Let me know down in the comment section below your thoughts on the hardcore wipe up to this point, whether or not it was a failure in your eyes, and be sure to subscribe for more videos about the inevitable changes coming to the game that may or may not enhance the hardcore experience in a way that players actually agree upon. Hope to see you in future ones.